Welcome to day 2 of our 2-day Council of Holocaust Educators Conference. This is the 19th annual conference, and this conference is focused on life after liberation, the continuance of violence. So welcome back everyone to day 2. I said this last time, but we have now facilitated so many CHE conferences, and each one has been unique and wonderful, but this one's extra unique because we are doing it as a fully virtual experience. My name is Sarah Brown, and I am the Executive Director of the Center for Holocaust, Human Rights, and Genocide Education. And before I continue, I want to recognize that our center is housed on the occupied territory of the Lenape people. Now, this year's conference is focused on survivor experiences after liberation. And on Tuesday evening, we enjoyed a brilliant keynote that was delivered by Dr. Joanna Sliwa. And she offered this rich review of the experiences of Polish Jews, the majority of whom were children, after liberation. And it offered some really incredible opportunities for incorporating the human story, or as Colleen put it, the micro histories into our existing Holocaust education, our curriculum as it stands. Now, if for anyone that missed Tuesday's program, don't worry, there's a recording that is available. You should have received a link to it with the registration email, but if you didn't, for whatever reason, reach out to us and we will get you a copy of it. Now, as I said on Tuesday, that human story really speaks to Chhange's commitment to telling the human experience of genocide. And it is central to our efforts to harness innovative education about the Holocaust, other instances of genocide and human rights in order to promote the elimination of all forms of anti-Semitism, prejudice, and racism. So we're thrilled to be here with you today and to learn with you today. Now, before I turn things over to our 2 panelists, I want to cover a couple of housekeeping items and today's agenda very briefly. So first, right now we've muted your audio, but the chat feature is enabled. So please feel free to say hello through the chat box and let us know which school you are hailing from. At the end of our presentation, we will have a question and answer period. And if you would like to ask a question, and we hope that you will, please use the raise hand feature or physically raise your hand and we will unmute you so that you can ask a question. If you prefer, you can also type your questions into the chat box. We're going to be flexible and allow for however people want to engage. And we're going to try to get to as many questions as possible. Please, please, please participate. After our panel, we will have a 10-minute break before we go on to the next session. And during that session, I want to note that you should be prepared to participate in some breakout discussions about virtual teaching and learning about the Holocaust. And then we are going to close the second day, part 2, of this interactive program with a discussion as a group. Now, normally this is the part where I read out a bio, but because the 2 speakers that we're going to hear from today are going to share their life stories, I don't feel like this is necessary. So instead, I would like to just briefly hand things over to our first of 2 panelists. We're going to hear from Dr. Wolfgang Elsner, and then we are going to hear from Howard Dorman. And so Wolfgang, I'd like to hand things over to you. I am going to mute myself and then you get to take over. Thank you, Wolfgang. Oh, I think you're muted still, Wolfgang. Sorry, let me see if I can unmute you.
Is that it?
There, we hear you. Hi.
You can hear me. Wonderful.
Yes.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon. It's a distinct pleasure to address you this afternoon. And I wish to thank Chhange and Sarah and her staff for giving me this opportunity to tell my story. I'm also very honored to share this panel with Howard. Before starting, let me just say, I've been on your end of a number of these Zoom meetings, but I've never been on the, on the speaker's end. So I got to tell you, I miss having you all in one room where we can, share the atmosphere and we can, I can literally look you in the eye and gauge your reaction. So I'm sorry that we're going to miss that, but so be it. Anyway, my story is this. I was born in June 1943 in the very center of Berlin to a Jewish father and a Protestant mother. Under the Nazi race laws introduced in 1935, their marriage, although legal, was considered a mixed marriage, or in German, a Mischehe, and I was categorized as a Mischling, or of mixed race. The first 2 years of my life were a constant struggle to survive. On the one hand, we lived under the ever-present threats of my father's possible arrest and deportation by the Nazis. And on the other hand, injury or death from the often twice daily air raids by British and American bombers. As a toddler, I learned to count to 13 because that was the number of steps down into the air raid shelter of our building. My mother would carry me in her arms and would count aloud as we descended so as not to trip in the darkness of the blackouts. A few words about my parents and their background. My parents were old enough to have experienced World War I and its aftermath. They were both born in Berlin in 1902 and 1904, respectively. They were both forced to leave school before the end of the war in 1918 to enter the workforce. They lived through the economic and political upheaval of the Great German Depression and hyperinflation of the 1920s. When Hitler came to power in 1933, my father lost his job as editor and bureau chief of the Düsseldorf office of the German news agency called Wolfs Telegrafenbüro, or WTB, which at the time was the equivalent to Reuters in Britain and Havas in France, or for that matter, the AP today in the United States. After losing his job, my parents returned to Berlin and opened a private firm in my mother's name that offered business services such as typing of manuscripts, accounting, translations of business correspondence, etc. One of their clients was the world-renowned author, poet, and screenwriter Erich Kästner. Kästner is probably best known in the US as the author of the book on which the movie The Parent Trap is based. My parents operated this firm until 1939, when the authorities declared it to be a business under Jewish influence, effectively forcing it to shut down as they lost all their clients. My mother returned to employment, doing the kind of accounting and secretarial work that she had been doing in the 1920s. In 1940, my father was conscripted into forced labor, first in subterranean construction and later in a battery factory. In September of 1942, my paternal grandmother and her brother and sister, so my father's mother and aunt and uncle, were all deported to Theresienstadt, where they ultimately perished. Although wholesale deportations of Jews continued, the Nazis were always ambivalent about what to do with Jews in mixed marriages, such as my father, for fear of losing popular support. Nevertheless, my father was arrested in late February of 1943 and briefly held at a detention facility on Rosenstrasse in Berlin. He was released a week later after a series of street protests by non-Jewish relatives in an incident that became known as the Rosenstrasse protests. This episode was the only instance of a successful popular resistance to the Nazis. And if this works, I will show my first slide here. Let's see if I can do share screen. And there it is. Can everybody see that?
We can see it.
Okay, so this is the document that is, this is the release paper for my father from the his imprisonment in Rosenstrasse. The thing that strikes me about this is that it is not on any official letterhead. It's just a very simple piece of paper with hastily typed entries, which says to me that they were not prepared to release anybody. So in a hurry, when they decided to release everybody, they typed up these things, and my father kept it, and I have it to this day. Interesting comment on the bottom in German says, "Es wurden ihm keine Lebensmittelkarten ausgefolgt," which means he received no ration cards. So moving on, at this point, my father was reassigned to forced labor with the Reich Association for Jews at the Jewish hospital in Berlin until the end of the war. When I was born 4 months later, my parents found a Protestant minister, a member of the breakaway confessing church founded by Dietrich Bonhoeffer and others, who would risk his own arrest by baptizing me in a secret ceremony in our apartment in the middle of the night. By having a non-Jewish child, this conferred certain privileges to my father, including the ability to no longer have to wear the star. So he was able to take off his star, and here it is. This is my father's star that he kept all this time, and that I have to this day. At the end of 1944, my mother was also conscripted into forced labor, which required her to take me along in a stroller through the ruins of Berlin and under the constant threat of air raids. So this was the situation in Berlin that we lived in when the war ended. But after the D-Day invasion of Normandy, the hope had always been that the Western Allies would ultimately liberate Berlin. However, history records that the Americans stopped their advance at the Elbe River, well west of the city, allowing instead the Soviets to encircle and to capture Berlin. Thus, when VE Day finally came on May 8th of 1945, it did not mean liberation for us in Berlin. To the contrary, it meant that the terror of the Nazis would just be replaced by the terror of the Soviets. By all accounts, the Soviets were brutal and vengeful to the defeated Germans. Although my parents spared me the more sordid details, they would tell me of the conscripting of men into forced labor and of the endless plundering. One of the more amusing aspects of this is there's a famous photograph that you can find on the internet of soldiers raising the Soviet flag over the Reichstag, where one of them can be seen wearing multiple watches. This picture was later retouched by the Russians and reissued with a soldier wearing just one watch. While an amusing anecdote, it does illustrate how much plundering was a part of the Russian occupation. My father was once again dragged into forced labor, this time ripping up the tracks of the tram system, which the troops were planning to take back to their own cities to reinstall there. The two Russian words that I learned from my parents were Uri for watch and Rabota for work. The Soviets also weren't particularly sympathetic toward the remaining Jews in Berlin. They suspected that any Jews who had survived were probably Nazi collaborators. When they arrived at the Jewish hospital during the battle for Berlin, my father described them as being incredulous at finding Jews alive. One of the officers exclaimed in a broken German, "Keine Juden," alle Juden kaputt, or no Jews, all Jews destroyed. In fact, the Russians shot many of the Jews in Germany, including the head of the German hospital. And my father could have been one of them as well. Years later, as my father suffered from periodic bouts of depression and PTSD, the 2 months that we spent under the Soviet occupation affected him as much as the 12 years under the Nazis. Luckily for us, this situation changed 2 months later in July. At the Yalta conference earlier that year, it had also been agreed to divide Berlin into 4 occupation zones. So on July 4th, 1945, the Americans took over control of their zone. It was our great fortune that our home in the Friedenau section of Berlin ended up squarely in the American sector, and Soviet troops were replaced by American GIs. Nevertheless, the first couple of post-war years in Berlin weren't a whole lot easier. The city had suffered massive destruction, food remained rationed and scarce than ever, and the winters of 45 to 46 and 46 to 47 were particularly cold and hard. Humanitarian aid was delivered by various relief organizations, like the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, or UNRWA, by the Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, commonly referred to as just the Joint, and by CARE. There ensued a lively barter economy in which people would trade items provided in the various packages of food and toiletries. My parents, being non-smokers, used to trade cigarettes for extra food or more important items. In fact, cigarettes became a common form of informal currency for several years after the war, useful for bribes, barter, or purchase of any number of necessities. My earliest childhood memories are from this period. I have a dim memory of the GIs who were billeted nearby and who would ply the children with candy and, to my parents' horror, with chewing gum. On my 4th birthday, I got one of my very favorite toys, a toy Jeep, olive green, and complete with a white star and circle on the hood. And here is come on. There it is. Share.
We see it.
Is it? So there am I as a 4-year-old, holding this little toy Jeep. And I don't know if you can make it out on the screen, but there's the white star and with the white circle identifying it as an American Jeep. Again, one of my favorite toys. And I have to click OK here. So later that year, in October of 1945, my father was hired as an editor for domestic politics for the newly founded newspaper, Der Tagesspiegel, which is not to be confused with the weekly news magazine, Der Spiegel. Der Tagesspiegel was the first newly licensed daily paper in the American sector. It later went on to become Berlin's premier newspaper, equivalent to our New York Times here or the Washington Post in Washington, and is published to this day. My father used his editorial position to write about and to advocate for the remaining Jews in Germany, both those who had survived there, as well as those who were transiting from Eastern European countries on their way to the Americas or to Palestine. Even after the war, the Jews in Germany were not made to feel particularly welcome. Paraphrasing my father in one of his columns in the Tagesspiegel, Hitler may have been gone, but anti-Semitism remained. Now, even though my father now had a responsible position in his chosen profession with a premier newspaper for the first time in 12 years, the fact remained that our future in Berlin remained bleak. Reconstruction was barely beginning. Widespread hunger and fuel shortages remained and persisted for the next 2 years. The Marshall Plan, which was to lead to the economic miracle of the 1950s, was not enacted until 1948. And here I would like to show a picture .
We see it.
That shows, this picture shows the conditions in Germany in, as late as, this picture is, it's probably hard to see on your screen, but it was taken March 31st of 1947. So almost 2 full years after the war. You can see the ruined building in the back, and there's a demonstration, and there's a man holding up a sign in German, wir wollen Kohle, wir wollen Brot, meaning we want coal for heating and we want bread. So even 2 years after the war, conditions were pretty grim in Germany. And on top of that, there always remained the inescapable presence of Soviet troops, which surrounded Berlin on all sides and which could take the city in a manner of hours. So it's understandable that in the summer of 1946, my parents began to plan and to prepare for our emigration to Colombia in South America. Colombia was an available destination for us since both my uncle Ernst and some cousins of my father's had settled there before the war and were in a position to pull the necessary diplomatic strings from their end. Having experienced the aftermath of World War I, the calamity of the Nazi years and World War II, and now with a young child, my parents were not about to pass up the opportunity to get out when it presented itself. And thus it came that on June 10th of 1947, we finally left our home in Berlin on our way to a new world and a new life. The principal impediment to immigration was that Germany was an occupied nation and had no diplomatic relations with other countries, and thus lacked embassies or consulates with the appropriate consulates would, lacked the embassies or consulates that would grant them visas. Immigrating Germans needed a transit country with the appropriate consulates that would accept them on a temporary basis. Our transit country turned out to be France. And so we were first headed to Paris. In Tegel, in the French sector of Berlin, we boarded a French military train that would take us through the Soviet occupation zone via Frankfurt to Kehl, across the Rhine from Strasbourg. And then from Strasbourg, another train took us to Paris, where we arrived on June 13th. And I can share this. This is the train station in Berlin from where we left, and which exists today and has been turned into a museum. My wife, Chris, and I visited here in 2014. That's when I took this picture. moving on. The assistance of the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, or HIAS, was an indispensable component of our immigration. HIAS was founded in 1881 and has been dedicated to humanitarian aid and assistance to refugees all over the world. In the aftermath of World War II, it was instrumental in the resettlement of 150,000 refugees from Germany and Eastern Europe to North and South America, Australia, and Palestine. HIAS facilitated the procurement of all necessary documents and arranged and paid for transportation, accommodations, and all expenses throughout our journey. I also want to give a shout out to the French government and to the French people. My parents were forever grateful to them for their hospitality and generosity. After 2 world wars in just the first half of the century, after all the territorial disputes, and after a brutal 4-year occupation by the Nazis, the French might have been forgiven for a certain amount of hostility toward us Germans. Instead, my parents felt welcome from the moment they stepped on the train in the Berlin-Tegel air station and the French sector. Right away, a pair of French civilians who spoke German and a pair of French soldiers befriended us, and they soon broke out with bottles of champagne and cognac. At the repatriation center in Kehl, we were provided with sumptuous meals and comfortable overnight accommodations before the next day's trip to Paris, all arranged by HIAS. In the lengthy journal that my father wrote about our journey from Berlin to Bogota, he wrote, in all, quite a contrast to the manner in which the victims of fascism are treated in Germany. We will always be grateful for the welcome that the French state extended even to us German victims of fascism. That's a quote from my father. Now, as the poet Robert Burns said, or paraphrasing, the best laid plans of mice and men go awry. What we expected to be a brief stay in Paris turned into a 6-month-long sojourn, during which the end was always just out of sight. The so-called Exodus affair, in which some 4,500 Jewish refugees had attempted to land illegally in Palestine and were turned back by the British, had taken place just after we arrived in Paris. None of the Exodus refugees had valid visas for Palestine, but were instead traveling on visas issued by other countries, including by Colombia, and had obtained them under false pretenses. As a result, Colombia placed a moratorium on issuing any further visas to Jewish emigres, and we were stuck. As always, HIAS came through by paying for our stay at the hotel in Paris and by providing a weekly allowance for food, clothing, and expenses. This permitted us to lead a reasonably comfortable life. And due to the length of our stay, the city of Paris even granted us temporary residence status, which entitled us to the same level of rations as Parisian citizens. The moratorium on immigrations finally broke in the fall of 1947, and we obtained our Colombian visas in October. However, by now all transportation was backlogged, so there were no ships, no space on ships to run. It took another 2 months before we could leave. So finally, on December 22nd, on my parents' 19th wedding anniversary, we boarded a HIAS chartered flight at Orly Airport and left the European continent behind. And here I have this is a picture published in a HIAS magazine called
Refugee Relief.
Name escapes me at the moment, I'm sorry. Anyway, it's published by Hayes, and it shows a group of Hayes proteges leaving Paris aboard a plane to take them to, of all places, Colombia. This group had been stranded in France by the shortage of ships. While this is not a picture of us, this is a picture of people who left in September. We must have looked something like this. After a 5-day trip with 4 stopovers in the Azores, Bermuda, Curacao, and Panama, we finally arrived in Bogota, Colombia's capital, on December 27th, 1947, to begin our new lives in a new country. I'll conclude briefly by sketching out the path that brought me from Colombia in 1947 to this afternoon before you. In 1958, when I was 15, my parents sent me to the US to complete my high school education and to continue on to college. A family in upstate New York hosted me for a year. And then in 1959, my parents followed me to the US, where we settled in Brooklyn. I graduated from James Madison High School and went on to Clarkson University back in upstate New York. After earning a bachelor's, master's, and PhD in engineering, I had a 25-year career with Bell Laboratories in Homedale, New Jersey. And after another 4 years with Lucent Technologies, I retired in 2002. Earlier this year, my wife, Chris, who is sitting over my left shoulder, encouraged me to organize and to catalog all the documents and journals that my parents left behind when they passed away some 30 years ago, and introduced me to Chhange. My presence here this afternoon and the scrapbook of my story are the products of a close and productive collaboration with Sarah and her staff, with Nicole, for which I am extremely grateful. Thank you.
Wolfgang, I've now had the pleasure and the honor to hear your story and learn your story in such great detail, but this is the first time I get to hear you tell it in your own words. And not to brag about you, but to brag about you. This was also your first time sharing it with an audience. And you did such a beautiful job. I mean, clearly, and you probably should have noted to the audience, you're also a bit of a recovering educator. So that was very evident in how well you were able to cover some very detailed and very hard times in your family's history. That was just, thank you.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate that.
But just, yes, bravo. We are going to have questions at the end of the panel, but for now, I'd like to hand things over to our next panelist. And I do want to just brag briefly about Howard, just to note that not only is Howard a very active second generation survivor, he is also the president of the board at Chhange. So everybody be nice to him for my sake.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, everybody. Sarah, thank you, Nicole, Ali, for putting this all together. Wolfgang, it was a privilege to share the screen with you. And you made it. You didn't shed a tear throughout the entire program, so you did good. So let's hope that, that I'll work my way through this. So I am Howard Dorman. I am a second generation, and my brother Stephen, who lives in California, is on this Zoom presentation as well. My mom, or our mom, Ellen Weiner Dorman and Dad Victor Dorman, both were survivors of the horrors of World War II. Their survivals were on different paths, but their fate and luck brought them together one September day in Frankfurt at the Zalheim DP camp in 1945. So where do we start? My mom was liberated from Bergen-Belsen on April 15th, 1945. Maybe that's the reason why I became an accountant. I'm not sure. She was liberated by the British. She was 18 and a half years old. And I am going now to share, hopefully, I guess not. Sorry.
Do you want me to see if?
No, I had it. I must have X'd out of the picture. So I'm not going to, no, it's fine. She was 18 and a half. Her sharp realization, my mom, was nobody is alive. We only had one thing, and that was we all lived through the war. What is going to happen after that? Who cares? We're going to be liberated. And then we were liberated. And then you are alive for nothing. You have no education. You have no background. You have no way of making a living for yourself. You are a pauper spiritually, mentally, and physically. Nobody you know is alive. My dad was liberated from the Ebensee concentration camp in Austria, which was a subcamp of Mauthausen. He was liberated by the Americans. After liberation, I went back to Poland, to my town. I did not even want to go back to where I lived because all I heard them saying was they were waiting for people. They were sure the Jews had money and other things hidden in the walls. I did not want to stay. So my dad turned around and eventually found his way to Frankfurt for that fateful day in September 1945. You know, I realize everybody loves and cherishes their parents. It's hard to explain how my love and respect is any different from anyone else because everybody has their own story. I don't compare that my parents had a more or less difficult life than others. I know others have experienced pain and anguish in so many ways, but these are my parents, and this is the only thing that I know, how I grew up and developed a foundation for who I became. To know what they lost in their lives, especially in the manner it happened, I'll never fully grasp it. My brother and I grew up with no grandparents, no uncles, no aunts, just some cousins and some distant relatives. That is what I know, and that was my normal. It wasn't until my parents became grandparents that I fully understood what I lost. But what I do know for certain is they shared a life for 64 years as a loving and caring husband and wife, and a family that grew from two little immigrants that came to Brooklyn to 21 people, with number 22 coming next week and number 23 in January. My dad had night terrors until the day he died. Call it what you want, PTSD. He was a quiet one, and he harbored such hard feelings, which took me a long time to understand. He did come out of that shell eventually to tell his story and embrace his life. But mom was a fire plug. She made a decision early in her life to embrace what's going on. It wasn't right away after the war, but in 1957, 12 years after liberation, she started talking about her life and her experiences and eventually brought it into the classroom. And she spent the next 57 years talking to children. But she didn't talk about poor me, look at what I lost. She talked about how to build a better future. And all she wanted to do in each class was to change one mind at a time. So I'm lucky to have a blend of emotions. I definitely share my mother's look on life and her compassion And one example is my dedication to my years at Chhange and making sure that candle stays lit. And I have my dad's loving care for the one thing that mattered most to him, and that was family. Both mom and dad grew up in Tarnów, Poland. When the war broke out in September 1939, Tarnów had about 50,000 people, of which 25,000 were Jews. It swelled to about 30,000 Jews when the ghetto peaked in 1943. My maternal grandparents, Pinchas and Chaya Weiner, my maternal, mom was an only child, but she had a very, very rich family life. There's a picture of my mom. She's sitting down in her little sailor outfit with grandma and grandpa and my great-grandparents. The little boy on the bottom was a cousin who my parents became very good friends with, Sydney Amsterdam. And how do I get back out? Unshare. My grandmother Chaya had light hair, blue eyes, and she was able to secure Polish papers and was able to leave the ghetto. And she always brought food back to my grandfather and grandmother until the day when she was caught in front of my mom and she never saw her again. She had a very close relationship with her dad, especially after her mom was murdered. They took care of each other until they were separated in September 1943 when Tarnów was liquidated. Mom was a survivor of Plaszow, Auschwitz, and Bergen-Belsen. Grandpa Pinchas was in several camps, eventually died in Camp Flossenburg. My dad's parents were Yoshua and Pesla Dorman. And you can see I'm new at this. So new, I can't find the pictures. That's fine. My father had a sister, Sarah, and a brother, Theodore. Dad was the only one to leave Tarnów in that September 1943. They were all murdered in the town before the final liquidation. Please note, in June 1942, 4,000 Jews were shot in their homes and another 8,000 were transported to Belzig and gassed immediately. That was the first pogrom in the town. There was a second action in the fall of September 1942 and a final stage, which they called Action Jew Free in September 1943. When my mom and dad were eventually transferred from Tarnów to Plaszow right after that liquidation, they were only part of 4,000 Jews left in the town from the 30,000 that inhabited it in 1942. After being in a few camps, my dad was liberated by the Americans from Ebensee. So what happened on that day in 1945 in Frankfurt at the Zalheim camp? My mother recognized my dad from afar and came over to him. Was it love at first sight? Somebody familiar to you? My mom knew his family. She was the same age as my uncle Theodore. My dad and his two siblings lived for a short time downstairs from my mom in the ghetto. This was right after my paternal grandparents were murdered in the streets in the first killing in Tarnów. So my mom used to go downstairs and flirt with the boys, as she would say, but her father wanted nothing to do with it, as she was only 16 years old. From that moment in Frankfurt, they were inseparable. And it's there. And eventually they were married March 10th, 1946, and came to the US 3 months later on June 18th, 1946. They were sponsored by my mom's Uncle Nathan, which was her mom's brother, who came to the States before the war. They initially stayed with Uncle Nathan and his wife, Aunt Rose. Early on, Uncle Nathan asked one night the fate of his parents and the family, and Aunt Rose blurted out, "What do you think? You had it so bad? It wasn't good here. We couldn't get sugar. We couldn't get meat." We never understood that. Uncle Nathan was a butcher. I don't know how they didn't get meat. But from that point on, Mom never discussed the family with them and their fate until much later in life. Around the same period, Mom was shopping in an outdoor market in Brooklyn in the Jewish neighborhood. She used to wear a short sleeve blouse, and on her left arm, she had her tattoo. And a Jewish man looked up at her and says, "Oh, so you have one of those numbers. You came from Germany. You were in a camp. You must have been the one that was so good to the Germans." So it kind of mirrors what Wolfgang said before in his speech about how the Germans treated the Jews. From then on, she wore long sleeve blouses until she felt good in her skin again. Mom and Dad cried constantly, needed love. They sought the help of a psychiatrist. They felt ashamed and guilty to be alive in the US when so many others had not survived. Dad was afraid to walk in the streets in case he forgot his armband or his papers. Every time a policeman came by them, they would get the shivers. Little things brought them back quickly to the ghetto and the camps. But they fed off each other. It was painful to remember. The following year, May of 1947, as my mom is being wheeled into my Maimonides Hospital in Brooklyn, about to give birth to my brother Steve, the doctors were prepping her. One of the doctors lifted up her blouse and saw a scar on her stomach, and he cried out, "I know that stomach." He was the intern in Plaszow who operated on my mom and removed her appendix. So talk about a small world. Life post-liberation took them in many directions. After settling in Brooklyn, they shortly moved to Connecticut, where I was born. Then they moved to New Jersey for a cup of coffee, and then moved out to Kansas. Yes, Kansas. That's the state in the middle of the country. We were out there for a few years to eventually settle back in 1961. I guess the job opportunities were there, maybe just want to start a fresh life. Amazing, all the travels, but of course the pain was always there. That wasn't going away. So as I mentioned earlier, it was in 57 that Mom started talking to the class. An evangelical Christian invited my mom to speak at her children's school. I can only imagine how the conversation started. I guess you have to first explain maybe what a Jew was and then talk about the Holocaust. But all the moving around, better job, more money, see America, maybe part of it was to get away from the enclave of survivors and those reminders. It was a mixture of it all, but they were never ashamed of who they were, what they witnessed. Boy, but they carried guilt and they learned how to pass that guilt on, that's for sure. So, closing a book, I think, is an extremely important process in healing in anyone's life. I know for my mother it was. She was reunited with her childhood friend Franja in the 60s after they found each other 20 plus years after liberation. They both went into Auschwitz together, and on their arms, their numbers are one in succession. My mom was A-22351, Franja A-22350. Franja's still alive, and I communicate with her all the time. Sorry, Wolfgang, I did it. She's the one, Aunt. that I never had. Mom never knew the fate of her father until 1996 through the Red Cross tracing program she received from the archives a dossier of his travels during the war. We also received a death certificate. Could you imagine that the Germans took the time upon all these deaths to type up death certificates? It stated he died on March 3rd, 1945 from natural causes in the concentration camp Flossenburg. That was 30 days before liberation. But having this information allowed her and the family to do yard site every year. This gave her closure. This allowed her father to become a person and not just something in her imagination. One of her most haunting memories was laid to rest. In 97, my mom, my brother Steve, and I, we went to Poland. My dad did not want to go. The same resentment that he harbored when he went to Tarnów right after the war never left him. It was an emphatic no. Mom wanted to close the book. We visited Tarnów, where she lived. We walked through the park she played in as a kid. So an interesting story. Growing up, my mom had lilacs all over the house. She had them outside, inside, no matter what season, the house always smelled of lilacs. And when we walked through the park in Tarnów that day, she stopped and took a deep breath, and she started to cry. And my mom didn't cry much. It brought back to her those pre-war memories, because she was a little bit younger. She was born in 26, so she was 13 when the war broke out. She remembers the good life that she thought she led there. And the lilac smell filled the park. And that's something my mom always remembered. We toured Plaszow together. We toured Auschwitz together. She didn't shed a tear. She walked us through as she was giving us a tour. Her memory was remarkable. Matter of fact, when we took a tour of the famous guardhouse that is the lead building coming into Auschwitz where the train comes through, there was a small group of children from a classroom, and Mom spoke to them for a few minutes. Then we went to France and spent a few days with her friend Franja and her family. Dad harbored a lot of hatred and resentment. I remember I was probably 19 or 20, and Dad and I were sitting in temple during the high holidays, just the two of us. He leaned over and said, "How can I believe that there's a God? How could he do what he did to all of my family?" What could I say? I was 19, 20 years old. All we did was hold hands and cried. Now roll the clock forward to 1996. We're celebrating their 50th anniversary with the family and all of their friends. And I got up to make a few comments. I looked at my dad and said, "Dad, I remember sitting with you in shul many years ago, and you said, 'How can there be a God?' Remember?" So I said, "Dad, look around the room, your sons, your daughter-in-laws, and your 5 grandchildren. Yes, Dad, there is a God." My dad did get some closure as well. About 25 years ago, Chhange held an event where they welcomed the commanding officer of the American troops who liberated Ebensee and my father, Colonel Brennan, who lived in the area. In addition to that, there were 5 survivors from the camp, including my dad and one of his very good friends. So I guess you could say it was a camp reunion for them. I had last year the chance to meet Colonel Brennan's son, Tim, at an event, talk about the full circle of life. In 2002, a researcher from Vienna, Margit Brenner, uncovered certain files which yielded an anthropological study that was done in Tarnów in spring of 1942. The study hoped to identify particular racial characteristics of Eastern Galicia Jews in an effort to prove Jewish racial inferiority. Imagine the middle of all of this killing, and to purge the Jews, they want to do this study. 106 families were selected, which totaled 565 people. I think my dad suppressed this memory until that moment because his family was one of the 106 families. It was never talked about at all growing up, neither from my mom or my dad. Of the 106 families, only 30 families or individuals from those families survived the war, including my dad and coincidentally, Franya, my mother's friend. So that always comes up. Of the 106 families, 76 families, there was no evidence of any members surviving the Holocaust. Out of that, 51 families, there was no testimony anywhere. You had some cousins somewhere that might have made some testimony, but 51 of those families, there was no testimony at all. So this information that was provided, this is a picture of my dad. They took mug shots of the families. So this is my dad. This is 1942. My dad is just 19 years old. But what we got out of it, I got pictures taken in 1942 of my grandfather, grandmother, my aunt, my uncle, my father, together with background information on the family. Where my grandparents were born, dates of birth, where my great-grandparents were from. So I think for us and my dad, haunting memories were laid to rest. These images are now on display in an exhibition called The Cold View, Last Images of Jewish Families from the Tarnów Ghetto of 1942. This is a project from the Foundation Memorial, the Topography of Terror Foundation in Berlin, and the Natural History Museum in Vienna. Professor Berner has overseen this project for 18 years, and the opening of the exhibit was several weeks ago in Berlin. Matter of fact, I just received in the mail yesterday copies of the books of the exhibit sent to me by the researcher. I thanked her for bringing my family to life, as well as the other 105 families. They say you die twice. First, the physical death and the burial as we all know it. The second death comes when the last person stops saying your name. Margaret Brenner, you're an upstander for bringing these families to life. In closing, my mom so eloquently stated, our grandchildren should know what we went through. Sometimes I get terrible, terrible anger. How did they take our families, complete families, that there is no one left? There are no memories, like they never existed. The world needs to know and never forget. We leave our legacy to you. I hope you pass it on to your children and they to theirs. Please don't forget, and we hope that never in this world anything like this can happen again. Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to express this. And that's it.
It's more than that's it. That's we talked about this the other day, but you in telling this story and sharing out your family's story and giving names to them and full rich life histories to them, you ensure that that second death never occurs.
Thank you.
So we heard from two really unique and different perspectives from the Holocaust. And we wanted to, at this point, open it up and allow for everyone to ask questions. We each have a feature where you can raise your hand. I think we're all very familiar with that at this point. If you have a question for Wolfgang or for Howard, please raise your hand and we'll unmute you and let you speak. I see Mimi's hand is already up. So Mimi, I'm gonna try to, there we go.
Okay. First, I want to thank everyone. Oh, there's an echo. I want to thank everyone for putting this together. And I know it's a painful process because I myself am a second gen. Howard, what was the name of your parents' DP camp?
Zalchheim, Zalcheim.
Okay, because my parents were in Southside, Germany. I'm wondering if it's the same, different spelling.
Is it in Frankfurt? Outside of Frankfurt?
I don't know. It was an American zone.
Yeah. We'll have to share paperwork on that, Mimi.
I have paperwork. Okay.
After all these years, this is now, that's amazing. You've
Mhm.
known each other for how many years?
10.
Oh my gosh. All
Longer
right.
than that.
Thank you, Mimi, for asking. Does anybody else have a question that they want to ask? I'm going to scroll through and see if I can catch everyone. You can also ask your questions in the chat box if that's more convenient. In the meantime, while everyone's collecting their thoughts, I have a question for you, Wolfgang, which is really about the significance of a word that you used when describing the Soviet period in the area of Berlin where your family was living. You repeatedly referred to it as occupation, and so often we hear the narrative that it was liberation and it was cause for celebration. And I was wondering, what do you think of that? Because I know for scholarship, they constantly refer to this as liberation. This was the time when the Holocaust ended, but for your lived experience and your family's lived experience, this was a continuation of violence that often isn't recorded.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I frankly never thought of it as liberation. The only way my parents ever described it was, we simply traded the Nazis for the communists. My father, and this is why I related this, he viewed the existence under the Russian occupation, as he perceived it as greatly as the 12 years under the Nazis. He became, maybe he always was, a profound anti-communist. And I guess what he witnessed and what my parents witnessed for those 2 months that between May of 45 and July of 45 was just horror. So no, you can't apply liberation to that. Not in Berlin and not in what later became East Germany. It's the same thing, right? The Russian occupation zone, the Soviet occupation zone, that was not liberation. That was simply conquest by another country.
It's interesting because you are echoing what was said during the Tuesday our keynote session. Dr. Sliwa also talked about the fact that many Poles did not refer to the Soviet liberation as liberation per se, but it was just a new occupier. And they also did not see this as a cause for celebration because they experienced so much persecution and hardship under Soviet occupation. So it's just a very interesting narrative, and it runs counter to a lot of what we read and hear on this side of the pond.
Sure. In fact, for in Poland in particular, they were conquered by the Germans in 1939. And then they were conquered again by the Russians in 1945. It was just,
Right.
you know, who's going to conquer me, going to conquer you next?
An interesting perspective. Wolfgang, I have another question for you. This one's coming from Colleen. She asks, other than your wife suggesting that you bring your story to Chhange, was there another defining reason why you decided to bring your story forward and share it with us?
Well, you know, I've always had all of these documents with me, and I've always had the stories with me. And it was always my intention to someday I'm going to have to write all of this down, if for no other reason but for my children and my grandchildren, so they know this. But I just needed a kick in the butt, I guess, and then she gave it to me.
And our trip, when we took the trip.
Oh,
I can hear her in the background.
yeah. Well, see, what do I tell? What did I tell you? The other thing is, we 6 years ago in 2014, we actually went back to Germany and to France, and we spent 3 weeks retracing this route all the way from my apartment house in Friedenau in Berlin to the Tegel train station where I took that picture. We took the train from Tegel to Frankfurt, down to through Baden-Baden, through Strasbourg to Paris. And we actually stayed in the same hotel in 2014 that I had stayed in 1947, and probably in the same room.
Huh.
The hotel is still there. It's a wonderful little hotel in the 8th arrondissement in Paris, if you're familiar with Paris. And that was part of the motivation as well. Because I did want to, because my father wrote all of these extensive travel journals. There's a 30-page, tightly, single space typewritten journal of just this trip from Berlin to Colombia. My wife Chris just put up we have a copy. This is page one of 30 pages of tightly spaced in German, of course, travel log, and I wanted to retrace those steps and see all those places for myself.
You
And
know,
our educators will be able to actually retrace some of those steps with you. We're going to be talking about one of the resources that we developed with Wolfgang and with Chris, his wife. And one of them is actually an interactive map, and you'll get to travel with him and his family as they, in a way, ping-ponged around the globe. It's just incredible. Howard, go for it.
so I was fortunate that my mom and dad both were interviewed by Shoah. So we have the video testimony. I think I just froze up. Can you hear me though?
We hear you, yeah.
Okay. I'm physically okay. Don't worry, everybody.
What is it?
Chhange was my mother did write her memoirs, and it's called Her Haunting Memories. But Chhange also many years ago did a scrapbook with my mom. So, I mean, I have so much detail on the family, and but I have a lot of paperwork, and I have still a life's worth of work that I need to assemble to get it ready for my grandkids. But what I really want to point out is I know a lot of people, a lot of friends, people I grew up with, where they're both mom and dads really had a hard time and they weren't discussing it. And the second gen don't know the story. They don't know what town the parents were from. So that's just like having the family cut off and no memory. And so Wolfgang, you and I, we're fortunate, and I know a lot of the survivors, second gen that are on right now, have all taken active parts in their life in order to keep this candle lit. And it's so very important. So
Howard, by the way, I found the picture of your mom. Do you want me to share it real quick?
the one with the, yeah, please.
Yeah. This is a photograph of, can everyone see? You can see the photograph of Howard's very beautiful mom when she was quite young. She's what, 18 in this photo?
She was 18 and a half. This was taken in Bad Nauheim when she came to Germany with one of her friends. They settled in Bad Nauheim. My mom had a bad heart. She was told that she'll never have children. So that's why they got out of Germany. They weren't getting good medical advice. But when the British liberated her, they gave her a care package. And included in that care package is the blouse that my mother's wearing in this picture. And the blouse is on display or in the archives of Chhange right now. She kept that blouse for all her life. And so.
And then she gifted it to us. It's
where it
actually,
belongs, yeah.
it's on display. So someday soon when we reopen, we were going to be excited to welcome you back. And if you want to see that blouse and other materials, they're all on display as part of our Journeys Beyond Genocide, the Human Experience exhibit. I have a question here for you, Howard, which is, what was it like? What was Jewish, was there Jewish life, and what was Jewish life like living in Kansas? What was it like for your family?
Well, I'll be very honest. I was 57. I was 3 to 6. I don't remember anything. I either too young. My brother probably could answer that better. My brother was bar mitzvahed in Joplin, Missouri, which was 45 minutes away from where we lived. That was the closest synagogue. And the synagogue was really a Lutheran church that on the weekends they gave it to the Jewish population in the area. So I know we lit candles every Friday night, but wasn't going to Hebrew school. And we led a very conservative Jewish life from that point on. That's a very interesting question.
I have another question, which is for both of you, which is when you think about, here we're speaking to an audience of educators and community members, but how do you speak to future generations, so the youth, children who are in our classrooms today, and they're going to be tomorrow's leaders? How do you speak to them, and what are the lessons that you think are important to impart to them?
Wolfgang, since you spoke first, you can go first.
Yeah, I gotta think about that. It's such a cliche that, those who forget history are bound to repeat it. And that, I think, is my message to young people and to future generations. Yeah, we don't want to forget what happened, but not because of us, right? We don't want to forget what happened because it could happen to you, right? Be aware, understand history, and don't think that it can't happen, because it happened. And that's my message.
And it's still happening.
Right.
Maybe not to the extent of this and the systematic approach, but it's happened in Rwanda. It's happening today. So it continues. You don't want to. It's one of the challenges. It was even a challenge in introducing it to my children. I didn't want to. What's the proper age to explain to a kid, this is what your grandparents went through, and to my grandchildren. So, you don't want to overwhelm them. You don't want to scare them, give them nightmares. So it's going to be a challenge. Being that this was the first time that I've presented the story, I'll have to prepare myself to go into the classroom. Mimi, have you gone into the classroom?
I have this echo. Does everybody hear an echo, or is it just my end?
Mimi, I'm gonna put Jack in the waiting room. That should help.
You
Okay.
sound like you're in Dodger Stadium.
Yeah, I wish. Okay, I haven't spoken in a classroom per se, but I spoke at we had a luncheon, a survivor luncheon at Colts Neck Middle School. And I've also spoken in a synagogue, and I'm scheduled to speak in another synagogue. So unfortunately, COVID kind of curtailed my speaking. But students are interesting because in Colts Neck, they are exposed to it. They have a very good program there, and we have a very good relationship with them. So it wasn't cold, but I imagine going into a classroom cold that is not prepared is a whole different ball game. Haven't done that yet. Hello?
Oh, I will. No. I was about to
Oh.
say, but I can verify though that Mimi, your talk is very moving, and you also give this comprehensive narrative of the story of your parents. And I'll never forget the story of the chicken farm on Route 33,
Mhm.
and then being next to some sort of Wild West
Cowboy City.
cowboy city, and then eventually moving on to the motel. I mean, it's a whole story of really just resilience, and it's a local story, and it's a local story of success. And I think it's one that kids relate to as well, because the geography of it, these local narratives. Yes, your story may start in a faraway world that some of these young learners can't even begin to imagine, but when you bring it home to New Jersey, it humanizes the story on so many levels and adds so much depth. So, and we actually, just for everyone in the chat box, we just posted the link to Mimi's workshop. She actually gave a workshop for our colloquium this year, but May, and that feels like 10 years ago in COVID terms. But you can see it there and that's available for free if anybody wants to use it in their classroom. I'm trying to scan and see if anybody had any questions. If you do, just raise your hand or do the hand raise feature. All right, am I missing anyone? I really hope I'm not. I'm trying to look across the group. Okay. Well, I guess I'm happy to take over and ask actually a question, which is about something that Wolfgang said. You had noted, Wolfgang, that, it's hard to do this on Zoom, and it's hard to interact and not be able to see people, look them directly in the eye and feel their emotions in the moment and their responses. I'm going to put you on the spot and ask you, did you feel in doing it using this platform, did it feel effective? Were you able to impart your message in a way that felt meaningful and true for you? And Howard, I'm going to ask you the same question after.
Well, I'll let the audience be the judge of that. It just feels strange to just speak into a camera, which is not something I'm used to. I'm not an actor. I used to teach for many years at the university level, and I'm used to have get audience feedback. So it's the difference between doing something, saying a speech or acting in front of an empty theater is what it feels like. It's a little strange.
I'm scrolling through and I'm looking at my educators nodding as they're hearing your feedback right now. I mean, for them, this is their full-time job right now. It's so hybrid and virtual, but I know it's a whole new world. Howard, how did it feel for you?
Well, either way, I was an emotional time bomb, whether I was dealing with I think it's more difficult when it's an emotional presentation live, because all I got to do is look up and, if I see a family member or somebody affected by it, I don't know. I've been doing the Zoom for the last 9 months of some presentations. So it's cold. I get that. And right now, like for example, my camera froze up. So the only way I can do it is I gotta get out and back in. I don't want to do that. So, thank God there was no you know, it worked
Power
out.
outages like yesterday?
What's that?
Power outages like
Yeah.
yesterday?
No, I don't know. You know what? Usually around this time, I don't know, the internet around here, it freezes up. So
Mhm. I have one more question, which is from Joanne. Joanne, I'm going to unmute you so you can ask yourself.
Yeah, it should be working. Wolfgang, my husband worked at Bell Labs as well. We found it to be a not particularly inviting environment as Jews, and I wondered what your experience was. Oh, in fact, I'm going to add one more thing. There was somebody who worked for my husband who one day took him aside and told him that my husband should be comfortable. All he'd done during the war was guard a bridge. So what was your experience?
Yeah, no, I can't say that I had any experience like that. For one thing, nobody knew my story. I was just, brand new PhD from Clarkson University that nobody had ever heard of in upstate New York, and trying to make my way through all of these, MIT and Caltech graduates. That was no, that just never came up.
Okay, so Wolfgang and Howard, thank you so much. I know for each of you, this was a unique medium, and also for Wolfgang, this was your first time sharing your story, and Howard, also your first time. I'm sorry I forgot that, but your first time also sharing the narrative of your family, and it's just I'm grateful to both of you for choosing us and working with us and trusting us in our community. With your story and with your narrative. At this point, I'm going to hand things over briefly to Colleen just to offer a little bit of feedback and thoughts. Colleen is the president of the executive board for the Council of Holocaust Educators. They're the ones who we work with, and this is their conference. And I wanted Colleen to give us a chance just to offer a little bit of feedback before we take a break before our next session. So Colleen, I'm going to hand things over to you.
Thank you, Wolfgang and Howard, so much for sharing your stories with our teachers. And most importantly, thank you for the resources that you are willing to create for our teachers to use them in the classroom. This is so important for us. I had a chance to look at what they put together for your story. And in the digital format, it'll be so important for our teachers to have it in that format, because that is the format we're in right now. And who knows how long we'll be in that format. It seems like it'll be a while. So we're so appreciative to that. And Howard, if you could, with Howard's story, his family story, is there something that Chhange has that also reflects the story? A scrap, you said it was a scrapbook made a while ago. So maybe we could also share that with the teachers as well. I think what's great for the teachers is they can take the single personal story and align it to the historical narrative, which is what we do in the classroom. And there's no better way to do that than to give the personal story. This is what the students certainly walk away with. So we're so appreciative for that. And I think it's really a great opportunity for Chhange to make those available to teachers in a general sense, because Google Classroom, this is what it is right now. It's going to be this way for a long time. And it does give the opportunity, what it does do is kids are doing a lot more asynchronous work. So it gives us the opportunity to give students something like this and ask them questions and ask them to look at it on their own when they come to classroom. And certainly if you're available for the teachers to come in Zoom, this would be, combination for the teacher to have not only the scrapbook, but certainly to have either one of you or any of you come and speak to students. There's nothing better than that. And Wolfgang, I have a question for you. Your father's artifacts, the journals, are they in your possession? Does Chhange have them? Where are they right now? Especially the journals, I'm curious. You have to unmute them, Sarah.
I'm gonna have to unmute you. Hold on one second, Wolfgang. There.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Well, here's an example. They're in my possession. This is, the old style of touring binders, that my father kept everything. These are all the travel journals or travel reports that he wrote. In addition to that, I haven't actually done a count, but it's probably a couple of hundred documents going back, all the way back to my mother doing genealogy research because she had to prove that she was not Jewish in order to be able to run her business. So she went back, to her 4 grandparents, to determine that they were not Jewish. So I have all that stuff. Now, some of it, physically, I have everything. Electronically, I have turned a lot of stuff over to Chhange. I bombarded them with, ask Nicole and Sarah. They have way more stuff than they could, possibly put in the scrapbook. But to answer your question, it's all in my possession at the moment.
That
And
is
I have to
fascinating.
say, Colleen, he's so meticulous and so organized that he somehow knows where everything is. I am so envious of your organizational skills, Wolfgang.
Wow.
Well, I hear laughter in the background here.
I heard it too. Okay, and Chris's
Well-
organizational skills.
No, this all, when my parents passed away, they were living in a retirement village in Red Bank. And my father just had left everything in cardboard boxes. It was in cartons. And it was not organized in any way. And at the time, I was, more concerned with, raising my own children and sending them to school and getting them to college. So the boxes just went from Red Bank to my basement in Middletown. And it was really, and again, I have to give Chris credit here. She started looking through this stuff. And of course, it's all in German. Everything is in German. And fortunately, I speak and read and write German. She didn't. So she kept pulling out these pieces of paper. Said, what does this say? What does this say? And I would, quickly look at it and, give her just sort of a quick summary of what I thought that document was and what it said. And that led me finally to, because she kept asking the same questions about the same, 3 weeks later, she pulled out the same document, asked the same question. I said, wait, we have to organize this. So that's how that came about. And then now it's all, I have separate binders, I have a binder for my father. I have a binder for my mother. I have a binder for my uncle Ernst. I have a binder for, various things so that we know where to look for stuff. And then within the binders, it's organized chronologically.
So at what point did you realize when you were moving these boxes, what did you think they were? Just my father's stuff or your family history? Did you realize what was in there?
Well,
And at what point did you realize what was in there?
yeah, no, I always knew that my father kept all these things, but and this is one of the things I sort of shake my head at now. my parents were always perfectly willing to talk about these times, and they did. And they would speak about it freely. What I never did is I never followed up with any questions.
Yeah.
So they would just tell me whatever would come to mind at that moment. I would nod my head and go on with my life. And now, so I knew this stuff existed, but I never had enough curiosity to ask my father for more details than he was giving me, or for that matter, to look through this stuff.
Right.
And once I had it, unfortunately, it was too late. They had died. So now there are many questions that I have that, that there are holes in these documents that just make me wonder, what on earth went on here? Why does this thing not match that thing? What happened in between? And so that's one of my regrets, is that I didn't, I didn't ask follow-up questions. And hopefully one of the things I can do now is to persuade my children to not just listen to my story, but to say, gee, Dad, that makes no sense. How did that happen? So that I can explain.
It's amazing.
Colleen, I see actually that I think someone has a hand up. Do you mind if I take the question real
Go right
quick?
ahead. Yep. Yeah.
Steve, did you have a question? Wait, Steve, I gotta unmute you. Go
Can you
ahead.
hear me?
Yep.
Bro, I got to ask you, bro, you brought tears to my eyes. Two items which I thought was interesting. In Kansas, I was a bit older, and one of the first classrooms that Mom went to was my 7th grade class. And in respect to that, she went to my daughter's 7th grade classes and spoke about it. The other item is in Tarnow. While we were walking through the park, we passed a Jewish cemetery, and there were swastikas all over the tombstones. And just brought another sense of reality out of that trip. But thank you, bro.
Thank you.
Thanks, Steve. Okay. Colleen, did you have a follow-up? I'm mindful of the time, but of course I just want to make sure we caught that question. Did you have anything further?
No, just to say to Howard that I've visited Tarnoff many times with my students, and in reference to what your brother just brought up about some of the anti-Semitism that you see. Yeah, it's everywhere and at any moment. But I think that there's a real strong effort in that region to preserve Jewish history. And I know a group of teachers that from that region who do the past 18 years, I've been doing a Yom HaShoah commemoration every spring. And with students from Tarnow actually involved in that and doing it's like a theatrical competition. They do music in Hebrew and Yiddish. They do plays, little skits. They read poetry. It's really quite amazing what some of the teachers in that region have done. We've also seen some of the Roma that are from that town marginalized. And it's a real modern day lesson, I think, for students in how that exists everywhere. When I bring students there, we talk about our own indifference in our own country, not just in the places that we're visiting on a trip. But I know that I'm sure you're aware as well. I would love to speak to you further about the book that was published about the exhibit and talk a little bit more about that and where that's going next. If it's going to Poland, or you said it was is it at the topography? Oh, Berlin, or you said,
Yes,
yeah.
it was in Berlin. And I just was talking today to the researcher. It's moving to Vienna in May, but she's also agreed to do a virtual program with us to talk about the exhibit. So
let us know. That's awesome.
Stay tuned.
Yeah.
Details to come.
Yeah.
That would be great for the teachers.
But
I'd love to know more about that.
I'd like to follow up on what you mentioned about Tarnow. My brother's right. When we were there in '96, the Jewish cemetery was
Was a
upside down.
Yeah,
Tombstones were ripped up, everything. But today there's been, for the last couple of years, a lot of donations, and the Jewish history groups have gone in and have really memorialized it. And the Bema now is predominant in the middle of town.
yes.
And
Mhm,
the culture. I mean, I think they said there's 300 Jewish families living in Tarnów,
mhm.
which is crazy. But
Yeah.
I see that revision coming on, so that's good. So very good point.
Yeah, it is. It is. It's amazing and a lot of that has been driven by Polish teachers, which is astounding. These teachers are amazing. I've seen them do it in another town close to Tarnów, Dubrovna Tarnowska, and that's where they do this whole Yom HaShoah commemoration. And it hasn't been recent. They've been doing this for many years. So they were doing it for many years and it wasn't popular because people weren't paying attention to it. But now there's much more attention to it. There's more of a sense that Jewish history is Polish history.
Well, it's interesting because I think the first generation survived non-Jews in Europe wanted to forget about what happened. You know, in Germany and Poland, I think it's the baby boomers and the next gen that are bringing out a lot of the history.
Yeah.
So I only hope. I only hope.
Look,
Oh, I
and
look-
the educators in Poland are the ones who are inspiring these youth. I mean, that's such an excellent example, Colleen, and also Howard and everyone else. It's such a great example of how what we're teaching them in the classroom today matters for tomorrow,
Mhm.
every time.